Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Claire Dederer. Claire, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah. My name is Claire Dederer, and I'm a writer, critic, essayist, and my new book is Monsters: A Fan's Dilemma.
Thank you for coming on today. I enjoyed the book a lot. It came out in April. It got a lot of positive reviews that I saw, and it's really interesting. And so the stereotypical question, like, what is the one line elevator pitch for the book?
Well, I'm really bad at elevator pitches. I've always been bad at them, and oh well. So the I originally wrote an essay that was published in the Paris Review in 2017, and that essay was titled "What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men?" And in a sense, that's the pitch line for the book.
Right. I remember reading that piece when it came out. So you're responding to the cultural changes brought about by the Me Too movement, which we're still going through, and there's been like backlashes and
Front
back
lash.
yeah, backlashes. The book is also more of a memoir than I expected going in. I know you've written a previous memoir or two previous memoirs.
Correct.
Um, so it's an interesting format. And then you're also looking sort of each chapter at a specific case of one person or a type of person, and also like sort of including yourself. Yeah, a lot of both like self-reflection and yeah, it's very personal work. So how did you decide how to like structure this and that this is what, like, did you always know you wanted to have a memoiristic part of the book?
Oh boy, that's a really big question. Okay, so backing up just a little bit, the essay that the book sort of sprang from was published in the midst of the kind of Me Too explosion at the end of 2017. But in fact, I had been working on it for a couple years before that. And my previous book, I had written a little bit about Roman Polanski, and I had learned a lot about Polanski when I was writing about him. And I was really shocked to discover that I could still sort of happily watch the films, even though I had researched his rape of a very young girl pretty exhaustively. I'd read her deposition. I'd, read a lot of coverage of the trial, and he was convicted. That's why he fled to Europe, to France. And and yet I could still watch Repulsion or Knife in the Water or Chinatown or any of these great Polanski films. And so that just sort of seemed like a personal problem to me when I started writing on it in 2015 or 2016. So when Me Too came and sort of foregrounded this problem, I had already been thinking about it for a year or something. And so I had never conceived of the project as a response to Me Too.
Hmm.
And I think that that was really lucky that I started working on it previous to that, because it kind of put me in a more nuanced position automatically. I wasn't responding, I was sort of thinking on my own schedule and developing my own thoughts about it, and even after Me Too and after the book was sold in proposal, I kind of kept with that more leisurely approach. My editor, who's a great editor, just really encouraged me to not use a lot of super contemporary examples because she wanted the book to have more staying power.
Hmm.
So the book was never written in this kind of responsive mode, which I think I feel really grateful for, that I didn't have an editor who was sort of chasing the news. But in terms of the memoir stuff, that was always the question. I have been a critic for a really long time. I started out as a film critic, and kind of simultaneous to my criticism, I've written book criticism for the last over 20 years. I've also published 2 memoirs and written a lot of personal essays. And so the idea that my life might flow into this work of criticism was always there. But sometimes I worked on the book for many years. Sometimes I would throw it out. Sometimes the whole book would be a memoir. I went through all kinds of torturous decision making. But ultimately, the decision to include personal material had to do with the argument that I was making. The book is really trying to disrupt the idea that there is some authoritative answer about what we ought to do, that there's some kind of objective criticism that knows best. And in many different ways throughout the book, I'm trying to valorize a subjective response, a response that values feeling, a response that is aware of its own historical kind of context, a response that, sort of is about your own personal feelings about the art. Because when you think about this problem, you think about the biography of the artist, right? About the rotten thing that they did. But we also have our own biographies that shape our responses. So this idea of subjectivity became really important to me, and for intellectual and philosophical reasons. And as that happened, it then became important to me to include personal material in the book, just enough so that kind of my own subjectivity would be revealed the correct amount to the reader. Does that make sense?
It does. Okay, so you mentioned Polanski, and then if there's another sort of main artist who is considered in the book, it's Woody Allen.
Mm,
Um, or disagree with me if you don't agree
right.
with that, but they're I mean, they're very similar figures in a lot of ways. Like renowned filmmakers who are both still alive, both making movies as of a couple years ago. Um, one convicted of raping a child, one allegedly raped a child, and also married everyone. This complicated story of marrying his uh, partner's adopted child. Um,
Very
and
well done. Usually somebody gets it wrong somewhere in that of Warford's.
Okay, so their movies are very different, but they're very similar figures. What do you make of that, and why are these, and the movie Manhattan is also one of the main works you are thinking about, which involves the Woody Allen character dating a 17-year-old, I believe. Um, why did you focus on them?
So I wouldn't have to write a book about Kanye. Um, uh, so as I said, I was really trying to write about something that a lot of us have experienced, this sort of discomfort with the conflict between what we know about someone's behavior and the work that they've made. I was trying to write about something we all experience, but I needed to tell it through my specific experience, right? And for me, because I started out as a film critic, these were really, really important artists to me. I think that Polanski and Allen are also really interesting in I think there's something about directors that really they're given such free rein. This whole idea of the auteur and the person who's in control of all these other people. And there's a way in which many people besides me have written about the kind of, obviously the sexualization of the film set and the male gaze on the female actress. Like there's just a lot going on there that I think sort of gave rise to my thoughts about this. And they sort of open the book, but I feel like Picasso and Hemingway start to sort of take up a lot of space as well, and
Mhm.
other figures that sort of come forward. The Manhattan thing made it, it was really this interesting problem. I think that, you know, Woody Allen, I love Annie Hall. I love so much of his work. I'm 56. I grew up loving his work. He was really important to me. I sort of weirdly related to him when I was a child. There was something about the way he personified powerlessness
Mhm.
and kind of like poking fun at the man kind of. He was very, I mean, part of it is we just didn't have as much culture in the 70s to relate to, but there was something about him. I had a fellow feeling about him as a child, and that feeling was very disrupted by the story of Sunyi. And in the book, I don't really touch on the story of Dylan, who's the child that he's accused of molesting and raping. But having the relationship with Sunyi, Mia Farrow's daughter, was really disturbing to me. And so that wasn't something I sort of decided. It wasn't like he started having this relationship with Sunyi and I thought, now I am going to conflate the art and the artist and be disturbed by it. I think that what happens so often is that the biography kind of just happens to us. We live in this like immersive biographical moment where we know a lot of stuff about everyone. So you know all this stuff about Woody Allen and about him having a relationship with a very young girl. And then you go back and you watch Manhattan, his film about uh, having this relationship with the Marielle Hemingway character who's 17 and turns 18 in the film. And like in the opening scene, they're out to dinner with another couple, and the couple's also in their 40s, and they're all sort of sitting around on a double date, and she's got to go home and do homework. It's just, it's very strange. It's very expressive of a certain kind of so-called sexual freedom of the era
Hmm.
that is perceived as a victimless revolution, that particular revolution. But of course, children were the victims, young women were the victims of that revolution. Anyway, so I found that, you know, watching Manhattan without having it colored by my knowledge of what Woody Allen had done was impossible. And it wasn't something where I was sort of deciding to have it be impossible. That was this feeling that once I knew what I knew, that the work itself had become stained.
Hmm.
And, the stain is not voluntary. It's not like I chose to know about Sun Yi and then have it affect the work. It's inextricable. And I was really interested in that. Was part of the ethical and kind of philosophical dilemma I was interested in, because this is so often treated as something that is willed, to sort of conflate the art and the artist. And it's like, no, we do this. It's an emotional experience. We have this emotional response to what we know about the maker of the art. And especially in the case of Manhattan, where Woody Allen's um, personal biography is so close to the character that he plays in the film.
Yeah, I mean, Allen invites it, invites conflating the art and the artist in a way not many other artists do. I mean, Philip Roth comes to mind, but for a lot of his his stretch of great films, he's in it and playing some fictionalized version of himself.
Right.
Um,
It's the Zuckerman like persona. Exactly.
right, so it's unavoidable that you think about these things. Whereas Polanski, more removed, and I don't think he ever acted in any of his films. So that is some
Well,
sort
the
of
timing.
surface difference.
He does appear in one of his films, but I think that that's what's so interesting with an artist like, with especially with Woody Allen. It's like he's inviting this conflation, right? As you just said so smartly, invite is such a good word, and it's part of what he's doing. I mean, you see it in Stardust Memories, where he's particularly, people are asking him, "Why don't you make funny films anymore?" His character is being asked, right? And and then sort of, you can't not conflate them, and then somehow it's some kind of failure as an audience member when in fact you do conflate them. Right. You're somehow seen as a Philistine.
Right, and you recount a lot of different conversations you have with other people who have different reactions to a film like Manhattan. And I mean, they're usually men, or maybe they're always men, who you are quoting. And yeah, they're often sort of putting you down, that you don't immediately separate the art from the artist. Um, okay, so how did the cultural change of Me Too shift this dynamic? Because, like, you know, Polanski kept making, like, he was a fugitive from justice, right? And kept making movies, and some of them were critically acclaimed. And everyone sort of in the culture seemed to sort of be like, well, like, I'm making an excuse for it. And then, at least maybe in that early Me Too period, there was I don't know, it felt like there was a big shift, and people were like, how could we have thought this way? Or I don't know, maybe I'm oversimplifying it. um
No, I think that there's kind of two barbell perspectives that are really absolute, right? Like on the one hand, we should always separate the art from the artist and the art stands alone. And then on the other end, there's this sort of idea of some kind of usually it's presented as an economic justice, but that there's some kind of justice that the audience is then expected to enact, right? Where you oughtn't, really shouldn't consume art made by people who have been accused of especially Me Too-ish misdeeds.
mhm.
And so there's these kind of absolutes at either end. And one holds the value of the piece of art above all else, and one holds the sort of misdeed or the crime and the experience of the accuser or the victim above all else. And most of us sort of live in the middle, is my observation.
Right. How does this change when the people are no longer alive, like Picasso and Hemingway? So you have a chapter that lists starts off by listing 20 or so bad men, and one of them is Caravaggio, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and
Right, right, right.
who I believe murdered someone. And
Yes.
no, that's sort of a funny thing you learn if you take an art history class, and no one is like boycotting a Caravaggio exhibit, or at least I think they aren't.
Right. How
When
long do you have to be dead before it's okay?
Yeah, so how do you think I mean, so it's easy to say I'll never see another Woody Allen movie. I mean, I don't think he's gonna make another movie, but like, because I don't want him profiting off of, I don't want him making any money. That's like the easiest level of this. But the Hemingway estate, if that exists,
Right. Or the
there's fewer
Picasso.
like moral concerns if you buy a copy of The Sun Also Rises about like a bad person making money. So how does this change as as the bad person, the bad artist, the monster, retreats into the past?
There's this kind of idea when this question is asked of what can I do as a consumer to sort of like punish this artist or fix this situation. And I guess I, one of the things that I'm really trying to do in the book is kind of put a halt to that line of thinking.
Hmm.
It's definitely a line of thinking a person can pursue. Many people don't want to, for instance, line the pockets of Roman Polanski or Woody Allen or Kanye for that matter, right?
Right.
And that's understandable, and that's a fine way to feel. I'm not sure it's meaningful, really, on a personal level. Um, and I'm sort of interested in the way that asking that question resets the questioner as a consumer, right?
Hmm.
Like, you're then asking, well, how am I going to do ethical consumption of this art? And it just seems interesting to me that we move from, you have the situation where somebody's made an accusation, right? Somebody said, hey, something bad happened to me. And there's a million different ways this can be, not a million, but there's a lot of different ways this can be responded to. We can look for institutional change. We can have a conversation about what's going on. We can engage in cancel culture. There's a lot of different things that can happen. What often happens is everything leaps ahead to this moment where the audience member decides what they're going to do as a consumer, right? And thereby sort of limits their own role in the dynamic. And this idea of ethical consumption that's going to somehow solve the problem is like, basically, say you take somebody like Kanye, where an institution has been holding him up, helping him, promoting him, supporting him, and then suddenly things go sideways and he's hateful. Well, now you, the consumer, have to solve the problem. And, it's just, I think that idea of this limited idea of the self as only being able to express itself through ethical consumption is, it's just not, I don't think it's interesting or useful. It's just like this reification of the structure of capital. You just are
Hmm.
stepping into your role and being a good consumer or a bad consumer. And the comparison I make in the book is this idea of, we're all we're in this hottest summer on record, and we're, thinking that we're going to take responsibility by not using plastic straws. Right. So there's this kind of reinforcement constantly of what you're going to do individually.
Hmm.
But that's not necessarily your most meaningful role here. There's other roles that you have in this moment. You can decry this person, but you can also be a person who loves art. When you're talking about this dynamic, on the one hand, there is this horrible thing this person has done, undeniable, this, whatever it is they've been accused of. On the other hand, there would be no problem. We would just throw it all out, except for we love the work. And there is some human value and some meaning in that love of the work. However, it's very hard to talk about in the context of the stuff we're talking about. The accusations and the I'm going to boycott them and all these sort of these decisions we're making that are so absolute and are also emotional, by the way, kind of stamp a heavy foot in comparison to art love, which is more ephemeral and harder to talk about, when you're talking about all these different difficult ethical choices, and then you're like, but the opening notes of Kind of Blue mean everything to me, or are so beautiful to me, are so entwined in my own personal history. That's also who we are. We're the person navigating the love of the art and the horror at whatever the action is. And I feel like in this conversation, the love often sort of gets tossed out or ignored. But of course, it's the most important ingredient.
Right. And okay, why did you include the subtitle "A Fan's Dilemma"? And why did you, instead of a, I don't know what a different word for fan would have been, art appreciators dilemma, or something like that.
Yeah, well, if people, anybody who's written a nonfiction book knows that you like torment yourself for months over your subtitle, right? And this book, what I was really trying to do, and you can this comes forward in this conversation, I was really trying to think about the experience of the audience, right? So the book is not like some big, it's not some catalog of here's all the rotten people who ever set pen to paper or, put film into a film camera, into a camera, but it's meant instead to sort of describe the experience of the audience as they navigate these two things, the sort of moral outrage and art love. How do you make your way through it? And, there's some ways in which the book is read sometimes as a kind of prescription, like you ought to do this or you shouldn't do this. But the impulse, I think, is more descriptive than that. What is the experience of the audience? So and moreover, I think that I was really interested in the part of the audience that is non-rational, is feeling, is really connecting with the work, and the work feels vital to who you are. The way you listened to music when you were a teenager and it meant everything to you. It sort of created an out, or I don't know if that was the case for you, but it was for me.
Mhm.
It created this kind of repository for your emotions and for my emotions, excuse me. So I felt like, I kept trying to write all these subtitles with the word audience or the autobiography of the audience or something more kind of official sounding, but ultimately it just felt like the fan was the right word because immediately the reader knows that I'm in the hot seat, right? I'm the fan. I'm the person who still loves the work even after everything.
Mhm. So, in a lot of these cases, the crime or alleged crime is sort of something that at a different time in history was maybe not considered so bad or a crime at all. Like, beating your wife or something was domestic abuse, marital abuse was not a crime at some point in history. Whereas, murder has always been a crime. And you close with Miles Davis, and I know almost nothing about him or jazz or blues in general. So I didn't even know that there were accusations, or I guess what would we call them? Not accusations. He like beat women and treated people very badly. Sort of, it seems like a lot of these cases that cause quandaries are more like people come to realize that you shouldn't, like, a man should not beat his wife or rape a woman. And at some former point in American history, like, that was fine, or that was brushed under the rug. I don't even know where I'm going with this question, but it seems like, whereas let's say, like tomorrow, like Tom Cruise like murdered someone, and it was very obvious that he was guilty, and he ended up being convicted. That would somehow play out differently, I think, because everyone does agree that you shouldn't murder people. Whereas there probably are still some people out there who think, you can't really like rape your wife. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, there's this famous quote from Whoopi Goldberg. I can't remember what year she said it, but she said the Polanski crime was not, she literally said it wasn't rape, right? So there's this perception that somehow the mores have changed
Mhm. And
and
so it's
that
sort of like unfair.
Right, but
to the
you
poor
know,
men, to judge
yeah,
them.
exactly. And I think that there is this kind of when we think about the mores or the ideals changing, the sort of standards of behavior changing, I think that there's this weird kind of liberal self-congratulation at work where there's this kind of very hard to shake belief that we're getting better all the time.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
And that we're sort of improving, and now we know that it's not okay to have anal sex with a 13-year-old, and we're so much better now, and I think that, you know, this is a really slippery way to approach these behaviors because, the fact is lots of things that we think were accepted in the past absolutely were not, and in the chapter about the past, I write about Wagner and this idea that maybe his anti-Semitism was perceived as somehow more acceptable, but he himself, like he was very aware that anti-Semitism was outside the accepted realm of discourse in his
Hmm.
era, in his milieu. So this idea that somehow we're better is something I'm pushing back a little bit and pushing back against a little bit in this book. I think that maybe a more important or more useful question is to ask, what is it we're not seeing now, right? We're sort of like sitting around patting ourselves on the back about not thinking it's okay to have sex with 13-year-olds and the world's on fire,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So it's just there's this idea that we're improving is something that I'm pushing against in the book. At the same time, I will say that one of the ideas that I'm dealing with is kind of also pushing back against this whole concept of cancel culture and uh, the intimation in the term cancel culture that suggests that people should not say when something terrible has happened to them, right? That's all cancel culture or Me Too is somebody like raised their hand and said, "Hey, this person did something terrible to me." And what follows after that is complex and a kind of you know, sometimes a shit show. Like, but the actual impulse to say that something was wrong is 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 actually the thing that can make things improve and can make us be better. How can we do better if people don't say what's wrong, right? So there's this sort of weird simultaneous congratulating ourselves for being better and yet you know when people do speak up and say something's wrong, what's saying, well, no, we're not going to do that because that's cancel culture.
Hmm.
Do you follow my distinction there?
Yes. No, that makes sense. So we've, I think, exclusively been talking about male artists who you consider in the book, but towards the end, you have a section on both yourself, the chapter title "Am I a Monster," and also um, a group of women artists who abandon their children in some sense in order to pursue their art, which you and the memoiristic part of the book, you consider this as well in relation to your own work as a writer and versus, or not versus, but alongside your life as a mother. Why did you? So probably most people would not say that a writer who was a bad mother is the same as someone who raped or murdered or whatever. Why did you want to explore this aspect as well?
Well, for 2 reasons. It was a kind of two-pronged attack. On the one hand, I wanted to kind of give when women are judged or are perceived as, being bad people, the bar for what they have to do is so much lower. The things that are described as abandonment when done by women, right? Like, leaving to go make your art for several months or whatever are matter of course for male artists.
Hmm.
That was one thing I was sort of pointing at was this idea that you don't have to do very much to be monstrous if you're a woman. But I also, as I said earlier, there's the book is really working out of this place of subjectivity. It's trying to, I a big moment for me in the book was when I read the essay Mad at Miles by Pearl Clegg. So she's this writer who had really, really loved Miles Davis's work, and it was, like, interwoven with her life, And when she first fell in love with it, she did not know about Miles Davis's transgressions. So she fell in love with the work, and eventually she found out, that he was an abuser of women, and she was also a survivor of abuse herself. So the essay that she wrote, Mad at Miles, was just this like kind of hot beast of an essay. She's just furious. I mean, as she says in the title, she leads with emotion. She's mad at Miles. And of course, she loves Miles, right? She's working out of her own experience and love for him, her subjective, deeply felt experience, and also her subjectively driven horror and outrage over what he had done. She's mad at him because she is a survivor of abuse. Mad at him because she feels betrayed, and she's mad at him because she, a Black woman, doesn't want to be mad, doesn't want to have this kind of conflict around a great Black male artist. So she's bringing all her own experience to this essay. And when I read that essay, I really thought, I'm going to come back around to your question. When I read that essay, I really thought, this is what I've been missing in this conversation, right? I've been missing this not just freely shared emotional response, but this kind of putting on a pedestal or lifting up the emotional response and foregrounding it, because that's what art does. And that's what these stories do. They bring out this really emotional response. So when I read Pearl Clegg, I thought, wow, this is this incredible subjective portrait of her relation to this work, almost like an ekphrastic poem. And I didn't walk away from that thinking, oh, I should think the same thing Pearl Clegg thinks. I walked away thinking, well, what's my subjective experience of consuming art and making art? I'm going to just try to tell that as clearly as I can, the same way Clegg did. And then maybe that will create an opportunity for the reader to think about those same things. So all that's a long way of saying so much of this issue for me is bound up with motherhood. That my own experience of monstrosity, of feeling like a rotten person, has to do with shutting the door against my children or turning away from my children in order to make my work. And so it grew out of this really subjective place. It's part of a portrait of my own experience. And I don't expect every reader to share that experience, but it's sort of modeling thinking about it from a extremely subjective point of view. I also think writing about, the abandoning mothers chapter, where I'm talking about the conflict between art and motherhood, you could sort of replace the terms of that conflict with the conflict between self and care, right? Which we all have to deal with. It's the art mother conflict is not universal, but the calls of the self versus the calls of care either is universal or should be more universal, right? Like this idea of taking care of people is something, if we could flip and, parcel it out a little bit more, then mothers wouldn't have to do so much of it.
Mhm.
It is a conflict we all experience. We all sacrifice something in order to do the work we want to do.
Um, another late chapter that is very autobiographical is titled Drunks. And well, can you tell me why you included this part of the book?
Yeah, so there's kind of, without pointing at it too much, the book isn't, you mentioned that it felt like a memoir. And in a lot of memoir, there's sort of the main character, the narrator, the author undergoes an emotional transformation, right? You're sort of one person at the beginning of the book, then you go through a bunch of stuff and you've changed and become different.
Mhm.
There's a lot of ways in which this book is a political transformation. The person at the beginning of the book is kind of a more liberal, punitive feminist. She's more the kind of feminist who's like, what you did was wrong, and we're going to punish you for it, right? And what is sometimes called a carceral feminist, though I don't put that term in the book because that just was a whole other can of worms. But as the book goes on, and I lived through the experiences that we all lived through from 2016 to 2022, but also I went through my own personal experiences. I grew politically into thinking less about a politics that was about me pointing out you doing your wrongdoing, and more looking at systemic problems that are shaping all of our experience. And within that systemic model, I'm able to find more compassion for the wrongdoer, right? I'm able to say, like, okay, nobody is totally a monster. sometimes people are caught in this larger systemic problem. I can have sympathy for someone even as I fight against what they or even as I disagree with what they've done, or I'm heartbroken by what they've done. And of course, that compassion requires the understanding that that monstrosity and that there is some of that in myself, right? It's not just about pointing over there, it's about pointing back at the self. And so my own experience of becoming sober was part of that. It was actually kind of a political thing where it wasn't about like I'm going to be this sort of sanctimonious feminist. It was more like, okay, I'm down I'm in the mess of life,
Hmm.
and we're all trying to figure out how to sort of be a person and make it through. So the quitting drinking became a really important way of expressing that story of an expanding political compassion.
That's really interesting. I mean, you can imagine some type of person who would say, you shouldn't read like Hunter S. Thompson. Like I'm sure there's lots of reasons you shouldn't read him, but like he was using illegal drugs all the time, and he was like, or he was like a junkie, or just thinking of like there was a time where um alcoholism or alcohol abuse was maybe thought very like a very morally charged thing, and you could maybe say don't read that, don't watch that movie, the filmmaker was an awful drunk. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's so
I
I
do.
think it's interesting that you become more compassionate towards like both the filmmakers, the artists, the accused monsters, the actual monsters, and like yourself at the
Mhm.
same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the thing about quitting drinking, quitting any substance abuse that you're doing is that you sort of have to admit that you're being rotten, because otherwise you wouldn't quit, because all you wanna do is keep doing the thing, right? That's what it is to be addicted. So unless you were screwing up pretty royally, you wouldn't be quitting. So you simply by quitting, you're admitting that you are, doing some bad behaviors or well on the way to doing bad behaviors. And so that kind of acknowledgement is built into recovery communities. And I hadn't thought about this really deeply, but then I started to notice that, especially online recovery communities that are inhabited by people who are much younger than me and that tend to be recovering drug addicts, um, had a lot of fractious commentary around Me Too. And this is even as recovery communities have suffered their own Me Too reckonings, right? Like there's been obviously this is a really vulnerable population, and there's certainly been lots of abuse within recovery communities. At the same time, people who are recovering addicts, some people are suspicious of Me Too because of the idea that you no longer get to be a person if you did something rotten. Because if you no longer get to be a person if you did something rotten, that would be all of us, the addicts.
Uh-huh.
This idea that you are more than the worst thing you ever did became a really important idea, for me personally, for thinking about my relationship to the work, and then thinking about some political ideas as well that inform the end of the book.
um how do you see like where we are in the culture right now with a lot of this stuff? It seems like like maybe people are moving more towards the sort of the area that you occupy towards the end. I'm thinking about, and I think we briefly messaged about this, the sort of largely negative reaction to this exhibit that the Brooklyn Museum put on about
Uh-huh.
Picasso, that was co-curated by Hannah Gadsby, who is a stand-up comedian who had this breakout special in 2017 or so, which I think that's maybe some people look back on now as sort of like, wow, I can't believe everyone was so excited about this thing, or it caused so much tumult. Yeah, people seem to there was this moment of intense moralism, and I think the fact that Trump was president played into all this. And then
Yeah.
during the pandemic, there was also this a lot of very intense moralism related to race and racism, and then maybe we're like society has just moved on to other things. Yeah, where do you think the culture is right now?
I don't know, you know, it's been interesting. I feel really lucky I put this book out now. I think it's I do think that there's more openness to nuance in a response to these problems. I think than there was, you know, right in 2017 or 2018 when especially when the despair and rage over Trump was out of
Mhm.
control. There were all these new allegations coming forward. I think that it was maybe a nuanced conversation might not have been as welcome then, though people certainly seem to like the original essay, which, you know, contains some of the ideas we're talking about, or my original essay that the book is based on. Um, I don't know, like, I think the Hannah Gadsby Brooklyn Museum thing's really interesting because and I didn't see the show, so I can't I feel a little funny talking about it, but it seems like there was a lot of impatience with the kind of, thinness of the way of her politics, like, of the way she sort of tried to address the problem of Picasso, and then there was this sort of simultaneous thing happening where people were protesting the fact that she was showing in a museum that had a Sackler-funded gallery. Am I remembering that correctly?
That yes, and yes, I think that's right. This is
And
the family behind OxyContin. Is that correct?
that's correct. So they're Nan Goldin's been doing this incredible work, bringing their, misdeeds to the and their relationship to cultural institutions that are sort of, art washing the ill-gotten sources of their money. They're
Mhm.
using they're slapping their names on all these different galleries, and it's all been written about recently in Empire of Pain, incredible book. But, so there's been some conversation around the Gadsby thing because it's like, well, you're dunking on Picasso and somehow intimating that his work isn't meaningful while you're showing in a gallery, in a museum that has this Sackler gallery. So, like, I think that shows that people still are I don't know, I think the critique has moved on to maybe something more material or substantive, but I'm not
Mhm.
sure. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's often in like there's like a circular firing squad, or sort of like everyone attacking each other kind of thing can often happen in these areas. And yeah, so you have Gadsby decrying Picasso, but then Gatsby did something wrong, but then the person
Right.
accusing, maybe Nan Goldin's publisher has investments in South
Ugh.
African diamond mines, or whatever. So that
Right, we can
that's
go
sort of
on
a
ad
dead end.
infinitum. Yes.
Right. But also, yeah, and then maybe just more of a like Marxist or anti-capitalist critique has entered back in. And yeah, if you're doing anything with rich and famous people, like your hands are not super clean. And Gatsby special was on Netflix, and we've learned a lot about how Netflix operates and treats
Right,
its
right.
employees over the past couple of years. So yeah, so just maybe it's just people are tired of that sort of like moralizing, simplistic moralizing,
I
and
think so. I
that
mean, I think what's interesting. Sorry, go ahead, I interrupted.
maybe just that era was a sort of a hothouse aberration or something, and we moved on. But it's hard to say.
Well, I think that the thing that, again, I have not seen the show, but I think that from what I read from the criticism I read of the show, I think kind of the ingredient that they seem to share was kind of fatigue with the way the show didn't let Picasso be important or let his work be beautiful, right? And this is where we get in trouble is if we sort of decide that the work is no longer valuable. Who gets to decide? Who gets to say this work isn't beautiful or isn't important? Because if we're going to get into deciding that, like that's kind of a interesting thing to do. But also, I think that there's something kind of I don't know, like there's something kind of inauthentic about just writing off the work. It's okay to not like Picasso. I don't even really like Picasso that much, but the work has a lot of meaning to a lot of people. And I think that, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think this discussion is too facile if we don't let the work have importance. because then you're just having an argument about people having done rotten things. And where's the argument? You just throw everything out. But then, the sticky wicket, the part that's really meaningful is in the love. And that's the part that people don't want to talk about because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. And in fact, I get in trouble every day.
Right. Yeah. And if, you can imagine someone who was an awful person and an awful artist as well. And you wouldn't really, if no one cared about the work, then yeah, you write them off.
But it can also be like a personal lack of meaning. I'm thinking of my delightful and very smart ex-husband. I don't mean this as a dunk on him, but I remember him saying, well, I'm never going to listen to Kanye's music before. And it's like, well, you never listened to Kanye's music anyway. So it's not meaningful.
Yeah.
I think that what's revealed about this exercise, this book length exercise, is both that, these feelings we have about the crimes are valid, and that in fact, kind of looking at those feelings, allowing them to have meaning can be a feminist act, right? To say these matter. But also at the same time, the other thing that can be useful in this exercise is kind of reinforcing and letting art have its due, letting it be important.
That sounds like a good place to end things.
Great.
So the book is Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. A link to the Amazon page will be in the show notes, unless you have an ethical objection to linking to Amazon, in which case we can link somewhere else. But
whatever you do is fine.
Yeah, it's there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, as the saying goes. I enjoyed the book a lot. Yeah, it made me think about a lot of different things, and there's whole sections that we did discuss and further conversations we could have had sparked by the book. So thank you for coming on. I recommend the book to people who enjoy this conversation or are interested in this this very vexed question. Is there anywhere you want to point people who want to keep following your work?
Oh, I'm in all the usual places, all the online usual places. Yeah.
Okay.
Under my name, yes.
Well, thank you again for coming on, and thanks to all of the people who listen to this, and they can rate and review or tell their friends or try to cancel me, or they can do whatever they want. So,
as can we all. Thank you
right.
so much for having me.